Good morning, science lovers.
Good morning.
So, we've talked about alien life. We've talked about plausible physiologies for alien beings based upon things like you can only move in one direction at a time, and that if you're a living thing, you've likely evolved on a planet with gravity. So we can plausibly conclude some things about alien beings. We've talked about exoplanets and the possibility of space travel. And we've spent most of the year so far, or I have spent most of the year so far, on the topic of aliens. But some of you may recall at the beginning of the year, I gave you a warning. And that warning was that I was going to share with you some, what I believe to be some of my original ideas about some topics that I consider sort of between the line of philosophical, cognitive science, critical thinking, practice, as well as scientific method. So, since this is going to be some of my original ideas, I should tell you a little bit about myself and my background, which I don't typically do. I have an undergraduate degree in physics with a minor in philosophy. Most physicists also get a minor in mathematics. I took sufficient mathematics courses to qualify for that, but quite frankly, mathematics isn't something that I adored enough to be able to get all A's and B's. Some of you may be familiar with that kind of disposition. After that, I went on to study physics in graduate school for a time, and kind of got bored with it for various reasons. I think part of it was I had not selected a program of study or mentors that were appropriate to my particular interests. So then I studied some history in graduate school for a while, and then most recently, about 10 years ago, I did all the coursework necessary to get a degree in a master's degree in political science. So I've been kind of all over the board, and that is a pretty good representation of who I am. I'm interested in all kinds of things, and one of the things that one of the attributes that I find useful when considering any number of things is some of the training and the discipline, the rigorous, methodical discipline that scientists learn as they're going through their training program, and applying those kinds of disciplined analyses to other fields, for example, political science. So today, I want to talk a little bit about how do we look at problems, how do we understand the world around us, and all of that entails creating a model. Every time you think you understand another person, you've got a model of that person in your mind, right? That's why you know whether your friend or your spouse will make a particular choice or not in a given circumstance. You have a model of that person in your mind. Well, one way to look at science is that it is a feedback mechanism for building ever more accurate models about reality. Models that we can carry around between our ears and use to understand the world and predict the way certain things might occur, or understand cause and effect circumstances better. So all of our lives, we're looking for opportunities to build cognitive models about reality and the world around us. So what I want to do today is talk about certain aspects of some of those models that may be novel in some of the contexts that I share with you. Let's see if we can get this to work. Right, lessons from Plato's Cave. Many of you, I presume, have heard of the allegory of Plato's Cave. The idea is that there's these prisoners chained up, and they cannot turn around to look outside the cave. Instead, all they can see are shadows cast upon the wall. They may see shadows of reality. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I want to begin auspiciously with our fearless leader. And this is one of my favorite choice quotes from Mr. Trump. He says, "My gut tells me sometimes more than anybody else's brain can ever tell me." It's an amazing quote, right? I mean, we've all been in circumstances where we make choices based on our preferences or choices based on our gut feeling, you know, or maybe something doesn't pass the sniff test for us and we can't really articulate why. We can't delineate the reasons that might make us select a particular option over others. But thinking with your gut can be problematic. This is actually one of my heroes, Carl Sagan, and he said, "I try not to think with my gut. If I'm serious about understanding the world, thinking with anything besides my brain, as tempting as that might be, is likely to get me into trouble." Right? So, one of the skills I believe all of us can continue to develop throughout our lives, and this certainly includes me. I won't presume that where you are on your journey with regards to this, but I can certainly continue to develop my skills to think more with my head and less with my gut. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have compassion. That doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about things like rights for minorities and equal treatment for women and homosexuals and poverty throughout the world. All of those problems are problems that have solutions in the real world. And the real world requires us to think with our heads about what is true and possible. Gut level thinking often does not lead to good solutions. Let me give you an example. I hadn't planned on talking about this, but this comes to mind. You remember back, I think it was in the 90s or the early 2000s, there was this big hullabaloo over people in a poor country, maybe Bangladesh, that were working for $1 a day, or maybe something like that, in a shoe factory. And there was a big uproar about that. We don't want these people, this hurts our feelings, right? It makes us feel angry, offended, affronted. All of the empathy circuits that are built into our brain go off and say, this is ludicrous, these people are underpaid, these shoes can cost hundreds of dollars, etc., right? And there was a big move to shut down the factory, big political kind of incentive to shut down that factory. Well, there was a study done subsequent to some of those factories shutting down, and they found out that many of the children that were impacted by that instead turned to prostitution or digging through garbage piles to make their living. So that's one example of where thinking with your gut, saying that's offensive, my empathy is tightly attuned to the plight of these people. When you try to come up with a solution, make sure that the solution addresses the problem space, right? I'm going to talk a lot about spaces and the dimensionality of problems. Make sure that your solution is relevant to the problem space. Otherwise, you're likely to do something that could be ineffective or even harmful. So how can we think better with our heads? So here's the allegory of the cave. There are these prisoners. This was back in the age of Greece, and I guess they chained prisoners back then. Chained to a wall, and the only thing they can see are shadows. And when you see shadows moving on a wall, you don't know whether or not those shadows might be from real beings, horses and foxes and whatnot, or are those just shadows cast by someone who's trying to manipulate you? So one of the problems with looking at shadows, looking at something that has been overly simplified, is sometimes you don't know if there's some complexity or reality that's been left out. You can obviously tell the difference between a two-dimensional cutout of a wolf and a real wolf, right? We live in a three-dimensional world with our senses, but if you're just projecting a wolf, an image of a wolf, into a certain context, well, it's hard to tell the difference. Similarly, when you go to a movie, right? With computer animation and computer graphics these days, can you tell if that's a real dinosaur or a fake dinosaur? I hope it's not a real dinosaur, right? But we're pretty good at being able to fool our senses. We're pretty good at being able to fool ourselves. So one of the things that Plato said was that it was the job of the philosopher, and today we would expand that to include, it was the job of critical thinking, it's the job of a scientific method, it's the job of a natural philosopher, to try and understand whether or not these shadows are an accurate representation of reality or not. To step out of the cave even and look around, to bring more color and dimension into the world, to try and apprehend the world accurately enough that we can comprehend it better. So I want to talk to you about multidimensional thinking. All right. You knew it had to be in there somewhere, right? Now, I'm not a fan of people who espouse ideas like the link between holy geometry and the pineal gland, or quantum healing, or the quantum road to wealth, or any of that, right? So many of you, if not all of you, are on board with the idea that some of the more preposterous claims in the universe that people might make require us to bring to bear some of our sharpest skills for critical thinking and Baloney analysis, right? So when I'm talking about multidimensional thinking, I'm not talking about woo-woo like that. I'm talking about literally multi-dimensional analysis. So some of you may have taken a statistics class. You're familiar with the idea of multivariate analysis and independent variables and orthogonal dimensions. Some of these words might mean something to some of you or many of you. That's the kind of thinking I'm talking about, where you make sure that you understand the key, potentially independent factors contributing to the complexity of a situation or a context or a system that you're looking at. So I'm not talking about quantum nonsense. I'm talking about the Euclidean idea of multi-dimensions, right? I'm not going to be talking about non-Euclidean geometry today. There's a time and a place and a context for that, but it's not today. So let's start with the simplest Euclidean object, a dot, a point, a zero-dimensional thing. All right? So we can have examples of zero-dimensional thinking, and I will give you some examples of that in a moment. And the next higher level of geometrical abstraction in cognition, how about that for a sentence, huh? Is linear thinking, right? Where you've got, excuse me, especially if you've got two polarities, the right-hand side and the left-hand side of that line, that might plausibly, or some people might at least put an argument forward that these are the two poles that define this problem space. And then we can get to three-dimensional thinking, where we consider something that exists with many, three independent variables that can characterize its attributes more accurately. Or, for those of you who don't like the mathematical terms, another way to say this is how to hide an elephant in a dot. So here's an example where I take a cube and a lantern and I project a shadow of this cube onto a wall. Well, I get some kind of square, depending upon the angles and whatnot. It may not be a perfectly square shadow. Well, the fact that it's not a square shadow and that it changes its shape as I move the lantern around might give me some hints. Even if the only thing I can do is be chained to a wall and see the shadow, the way the shadow changes over time might help me understand a little bit about the higher dimension of the object that's casting the shadow. But there's some information that gets lost when we do this, right? It's still just a two-dimensional shadow, and the complexity of three dimensions is subsumed by that one-dimensional shadow. Now, if I change that one-dimensional shadow into a cutout, and I take a flashlight and I shine it correctly on that cutout, then I end up with a line. So I've turned a three-dimensional box into a two-dimensional shadow into a line, and then I can put a light bulb at the top of the line, and I end up with a little dot down here at the bottom. That's a projection. So our cube has turned into a dot. Well, you can say that in some sense I've simplified my system to a single point. I can do the same thing with an elephant. I can take an elephant, I can cast a shadow of the elephant, and then I can cast a light down from on top of this two-dimensional cutout to make a line, and then I end up with a dot when I project that line. So I've also reduced an elephant to a dot. Well, what does an elephant have in common with a box?
It's a dot.
Right, it can be made into a dot, right? There may be other things too. Maybe they have a particular overall volume. So talking about the volume of an elephant, if I were to submerge an elephant in water, I could then use some clever Archimedean mathematics to figure out the volume of an elephant, and that would be in cubic somethings, you know, cubic centimeters, liters, whatever the case may be. Well, both a cube and an elephant have a volume, so that's one thing they have in common. That might be about it. So I want to talk a little bit more about projection. When I project a shadow onto a wall, or I project a plane, a two-dimensional planar object, onto a line, I'm doing a projection. That's a mathematical term, as well as a colloquial term for what we're doing. So when I project a line, and when I have the angles of the projection just so, I can project a line into a dot. Makes sense, okay? So, here are some one-dimensional questions about reality. All you have to do is check the box. Are you happy? Are you wealthy? Are you conservative? Are you young? Are you female? Are you Caucasian? Are you alert? I hope so. Are you introverted? Are you blonde? Right? Single checkbox. Using this criteria with a single checkbox, we can learn something about you, right? But notice that this leaves out each one of these, each single word here, each single concept leaves out a lot of nuance, right? What does happy mean? Aren't we all interested in the question, in the answer to that one, right? So you can sometimes encounter people who will ask you questions. Fancy word for that is interlocutors. You can encounter interlocutors who will expect from you responses that are zero-dimensional like this. Well, are you a conservative? Are you a liberal? Are you wealthy? Right? And sometimes that's a gross oversimplification. We see lawyers doing this in court all the time, you know? Did you have a reason to be angry with your father-in-law? Yes or no? Well, this one, no. Yes or no? Well, about 20, no, yes, right? We see this happening in a court of law, and this is a perfectly good legal kind of argument, but it's a really crappy scientific way to do an argument, right? Because the scientific disposition seeks to understand to such a level that we have a good and accurate model of reality. So don't let yourself get hemmed in by zero-dimensional thinking. Well, we can elevate that to one-dimensional thinking along a line. And we've got that little glass bead there, the little green bead sliding around along a purple line. And now we can assign certain polarities to the two ends of this line. You know, are you content or are you depressed? Well, you can slide that bead somewhere. Are you wealthy, poor, conservative, liberal, young, elderly, female, male, Caucasian, Asian, alert, unfocused, etc. Right? So we can enhance our model of reality and our exploration of the system by changing it from a simple zero-dimensional yes-no to a one-dimensional continuum. Right? Make sense? Yeah, look at that. That's some serious PowerPoint skills right there. similar with two-dimensional thinking, right? Plain thinking, just plain thinking, right? Ah, so you see the pun there, right? All right, with two-dimensional thinking, you can just say, are you somewhere on a line between liberal and conservative? But you can also do this. You can say, maybe there's a whole separate axis of reality that we can use to model your political disposition. And one axis is conservative and the other axis is liberal. And then, watch the arrow carefully, then we have the ability to change the length of that arrow. All right? We all likely know people, and I'm going to be talking a lot about some of my friends, none of whom are in the room today. But we all know people who, when you confront them with a policy question or a political question, and those are often very different things, when you confront somebody with a question about that, they say, oh, I don't care. I don't pay attention to that kind of stuff, right? Politics, it's all just a bunch of scorpions in a cage. I just don't care about it, right? Well, maybe that person, the length of the arrow is really short. Maybe there are, maybe they literally are middle of the road. Maybe they tend to be more liberal or more conservative, but the length of the arrow says, I really don't care. I'm not that passionate about it. I don't research it. I don't think about it. I don't vote, right? So by representing a model of a person's political disposition using two dimensions, we have a vastly richer context and model, or toy model. I call these toys sometimes. We have a vastly richer toy for thinking about where somebody lies, right? I mean, how frustrating is it to come up to somebody and say, don't you care about X? Inequality, racial tension, poor, gay issues, whatever the case may be. Don't you care about this? Well, I don't really think about it, right? Well, maybe that's because their arrow, their passion, their political passion, as it were, is short, right? So you see, I hope, a good example of how it is that elevating the number of dimensions, increasing the number of dimensions, help us think more clearly about a problem and help us better analyze the contexts and the people and their dispositions, right? Other people and their dispositions. But we can do this with something else. This was actually the first representation of this idea that I came across, and I came across this when I was an undergraduate in one of my philosophy courses. At the time, I was coming to terms with my own sexuality. I came from a conservative religious background, and I ended up being a gay person and whatnot. And so I went through a lot of travails about that, a lot of difficulties with my family, and I researched, homosexuality. What does it mean? How can I learn about it? Because here I was studying physics, and I wanted to understand this problem space that dealt with me and other people like me. And so I came across this representation of homosexual versus heterosexual. Now, the more common way to represent it is this line down here at the bottom, where you're a bead that slides back and forth, right? You're either this or that, or maybe you're a bisexual and you're right in the middle, right? Well, by instead elevating that to a two-dimensional grid, or two-dimensional plane, we can start modeling it in a more nuanced way. We can start recognizing that there are some people who have very little sexual motivation, right? Sexuality, these kinds of questions just aren't that important to them. I am me, right? I don't identify as one thing or another. I'm just me. Right? And I don't buy into the labels, whatever the case may be. Or I have another friend who is not in this room, who this friend plans vacations and makes a lot of choices about social activities, etc., based upon ideas having to do with sexual identity, right? So there are people for whom that vector might be really long, right? That's another name for this arrow, is a vector, right? And a vector has a length as well as a direction. So for some people, issues of sexual preference may be a primary motivator in the decisions that they make. For other people, it might be less of a motivator. And using this two-dimensional model, we've got a richer model for understanding people's, how they might characterize themselves, or how we might better understand them. But you can replace these models with any number of things. Here's some examples. Think about gender identity, distinct from sexual interest, right? Think about gender identity. I know a person, once again, one of my friends, different friend, who has essentially neutral gender identity, right? So you might think, well, that's on a 45-degree line here, you know, male versus female, etc. But not only does this person have a neutral gender identity, but this person also has no appetite for sexual interactions, right? So in many ways, we can take a complicated, difficult to conceptualize set of circumstances or attributes about the natural world or other people, and by more correctly modeling them, in this case as a two-dimensional plane or space, rather than as a one-dimensional continuum, we can extract a lot richer, much richer information about them. And you can do the same thing with selfish versus altruistic, right? Are you selfish or are you altruistic? Well, I don't have much to give, maybe, you know, and I might be very altruistic, but I don't have a lot to offer because I'm a poor person. By the way, there are all kinds of studies, embarrassingly for human nature, that say that poor people tend to be more charitable in terms of their giving as a fraction of their wealth than wealthier people, right? Maybe it's because their empathy circuits are a little more engaged when they see the plight of somebody who's disadvantaged. But be that as it may, we can use higher dimensional thinking, in this way, in this context, two-dimensional thinking, to think about these issues in a more nuanced way. Think about contentment versus depression. Now, personally, I prefer the psychological concept of contentment over the emotional concept of happiness, right? Happiness is a transient thing. Contentment has to do with a dispositional characteristic, in my opinion, right? I'm not a healthcare, mental health professional, though. But in any case, you can imagine having a two-dimensional plane that represents contentment along one axis and depression along another, right? And in every case, you must be able to consider whether or not it makes sense to talk about the magnitude of something, right? Now, I don't have an answer for this, but I pose to you a question. It's both a practical question and a rhetorical question. Can you imagine a context in which, in a two-dimensional plane representing depression and contentment, where the length of the arrow means something about your mental disposition? I've thought about it a little bit, but I haven't come to a firm conclusion. But this is one of the strengths of this kind of thinking, in my opinion, is it forces you, or rather encourages you, to think about these things in a more nuanced fashion with taking more degrees of freedom, that's another term from science, more degrees of freedom into account. And if you think about a thing and you cannot come up with a plausible explanation for why the length or magnitude of the arrow might make a difference, then maybe it is perfectly fine just to have a sliding bead, right? So don't overly complicate things. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Okay. Here are some other examples of this, right? We often hear about, in issues of morality, morality and politics tend to be enmeshed in some ways, and there are different philosophical perspectives on morality. One of them is a rule-based morality that's called deontological, one of those $5 words, right? Rule-based morality says, you shall never, Or you will always, right? That's rule-based morality. And there are some cases where that is perfectly reasonable, right? You shall never unfairly take advantage of another human being, right? We could probably all get on board with that. But what about you shall never steal, right? Well, what if you have a starving child, right? Many of these things have wiggle room. So having a purely rule-based moral system can get you into trouble. There's another context in which you can derive some moral precepts, and that's outcome-based, right? What is the effect of this? Does it make the person happier? Does it make the world happier? Does it make you happier? Right? There are outcome-based moral frameworks as well. Well, maybe we can represent that as a two-dimensional continuum. And then maybe we can start asking questions about what does it mean to have a different length for the vector in that space, right? So again, I'm not trying to impose upon you my particular conclusions about many of these things, but I'm trying to help you understand that there are tools available. A simple tool like this can help you take a problem and recognize that thinking about it as a one-dimensional issue can be too limiting, right? Libertarian versus utilitarian, that's another, those are other concepts for morality that you encounter commonly, right? Libertarian is my freedom, my latitude for action, my ability to care for myself and do whatever I want is the most important thing in the world of morality and political action. That's a libertarian view. And all of us have a little bit of that, right? All of us take care of our families far more attentively than well, not all of us, but most of us take care of our own families far more attentively and with more resources than we take care of other families, especially families of strangers, right? So all of us have that libertarian kind of aspect to our choices. And then there's the utilitarian, which is what is the best thing for everybody, right? What is it that I should do that does the most good for the most people? Well, if you characterize those by a more complex space where you don't have to choose either or, you can find some compromise, maybe that's a richer way to think about it. All right, political freedom versus equality. You know, the famous, Ben Franklin who says, those who give up an essential freedom for a little security have neither freedom nor security, something like that. It's always paraphrased by me, at least. And then socialism versus capitalism, right? We hear a lot of attacks against socialism in the politosphere, in the society today. You know, attacks against socialism. Well, are socialism and capitalism, is that two ends of a polarity along a one-dimensional line? Or can that be represented more accurately by a space? And if so, what does the magnitude of the line, what does the length of the line have to say about that? This is homework for you to think about, right? This is not my view of the world that I want to impose upon you, but a way to think about these problems. All right. Now it gets harder. We're going to think about three-dimensional spaces. Right? We've talked about zero-dimensional, one-dimensional, and two-dimensional. Now we're going to think about three-dimensional spaces. All right. So here's a vector. This yellow line, this yellow arrow, is a vector drawn in a three-dimensional space. And believe it or not, these small arrows are all perpendicular to a particular axis. So this is hard to visualize because this is a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional space. So I have brought 3 dimensions. But then I thought, this is very small, and the universe is much bigger than this. So I now have a bigger three-dimensional object, and this is kind of pretty, but it's not as large as I want. So now I have this. And I've got my convenient, I was going to attach a rubber band and do the whole vector thing, but I couldn't find a rubber band at my house that was big enough. So I've got this point, right? This is a point representing something. And within this three-dimensional space, right, if this point is located somewhere out here, well, I can draw a perpendicular to this axis, a perpendicular to this axis, and a perpendicular to that axis. And that uniquely defines the location of this point in this three-dimensional space. So you're probably familiar with Cartesian coordinates, and that it takes three distinct algebraically represented points to define the location, three algebraic numbers to represent the location of a point in 3 dimensions, right? And so we can, when I talk about some of these issues, maybe this will help you to visualize it if I just leave this here. Visualize the complexity of some of these. Imagine whatever it is I'm going to be talking about describing a vector or a point in some kind of abstract three-dimensional space. And one of the, again, technical terms, for those of you who are interested in it, is the idea of orthogonality. Right? I don't know why. You know, physicists, especially astrophysicists, do a great job of coming up with great names for things, like it is a black hole. Right? I mean, they don't say it's a kafoofenflop, right? I mean, they don't make up these $10 words, but one of the attributes of a space is that you can construct these perpendicular axes, which are defined by 90 degrees in relation to one another, and the mathematical name for this is orthogonality. Okay, discovering dimensions. Now, this is true, these general principles that I'm proposing, I believe, are useful not just for thinking about three-dimensional problems, but also in thinking about a problem in general. You need to identify and decompose the problem into its relevant parts. I did this when I was a professional computer programmer for many years, right? Whenever you're trying to model a system, you need to decompose that system into its relevant parts and model each of those parts appropriately. So whenever you're presented with a complex issue, one of the first questions you should ask is, what are the independent orthogonal variables representing this space? Right? So another way to say that is, whenever confronting a complex system, think about what are the most relevant factors. What are the most relevant factors to help you understand and or model this problem set? Okay? And that happens in mathematics, it happens in computer programming. It's a core attribute of scientific analysis, right? Scientists are eternally concerned with the notion that they may have overlooked something relevant, right? Maybe every time I do a particular chemical reaction, it comes up with a different result. What the hell? Right? Chemistry's not supposed to work that way. Well, maybe the air pressure is changing. Maybe the temperature is changing. Maybe the ambient light is changing. Right? So whenever you do a particular analysis of a real system, in other words, when you're thinking about reality, it behooves you to think about what are the factors that are influencing the behavior or the configuration of that system. That's scientific analysis. And then logical analysis, right? Are these things really independent of one another, right? Is socialism and capitalism, are those really completely independent, or are they just different names for something along a continuum, right? So whenever thinking about a problem space, try to identify the independent factors that can help you more accurately characterize the space. Orthogonal projections and the loss of information. Now I'm stringing together several of those $5 words, but the idea is whenever you go from a multi-dimensional system and you simplify it, remember the fact that an elephant can be reduced to a dot. Whenever you take a complex system like an elephant and you reduce it to something simple like a dot, you've lost information. So one of the pitfalls of not correctly identifying all the factors that are relevant to the problem space you're considering, one of the pitfalls is that you will make an oversimplification. And we see politicians doing this all the time. One of the reasons for that is because they have to fit, their infinite wisdom into a 4-second soundbite. But there are other reasons as well. One of them is that they may not have the cognitive models, the discipline They may not have learned how to take a problem and factorize it and analyze it more critically and comprehensively. Sometimes there are cases when it's not an either or, but a both and. Well, either or is sort of sliding that bead along a line. It's either or some mix in between. But what about both and thinking? Well, in those cases, they may be relatively or completely independent factors, and we could do both. We could have both, right? I could be both conservative and liberal. This time I'm going to tattle on myself. I was recently taken to task because I'm not democratic enough, not liberal enough, because I have some misapprehensions about the social efficacy of public unions. You know, teachers' unions, firemen unions, and whatnot. You know, they can essentially hold the public accountable for giving them benefits without having the feedback mechanism to make sure that the public ponies up the capital needed to meet those obligations. That's why we get pension. Anyway, that goes off on a mark. I can justify my position. That's because I thought about it, right? Trying to figure out the different important factors. But I was talking to somebody who said, well, you're not in support of public unions, you must not be a true liberal. Or whatever, right? So by oversimplifying things or by reducing things to one dimension or two dimensions, we can lose valuable information and richness in our models of reality and of ourselves. All right, these are conceptual toys. Now, this is the part of the talk where I get into what I consider some of my original material. And please take that into account. I am not a professional. I've not published any papers about this. This is just some guy standing up here telling you about these things. And I encourage you to raise your hand or shout at me and say, but that doesn't make any sense. All right? Because I want to make sure my models are better. And one of the ways I do that is from feedback. All right? So let's delve into these. Here we go. Disposition. This is a cognitive model that I've used with to some benefit in my own life when considering the idea of disposition. I think there may be value, right? Notice all those wiggly qualifications. I think there may be possible value in conceptualizing it thusly, right? You've got an axis which is trust, you've got an axis which is compatibility, and you've got another axis which is complementarity. All right, let me give you examples of those. Compatibility. We both like roller coasters. I happen to really not like roller coasters, but I'm not talking about myself, right? So if you happen to like roller coasters, you can join a club of roller coaster enthusiasts. If you like nature photography, you can join a club of nature photography enthusiasts, or puzzle players, or game players, or bread makers, or whatever the case may be. You can find kindred spirits, as it were, and a lot of times when we self-select the groups we participate in, it's because of compatibility. We share something in common. Now, contrast that with complementarity, right? Well, I don't like going out shopping, but my husband does, so that's pretty complementary, right? I don't like, I don't mind standing in front of people and giving a public presentation, but somebody else, another one of my friends, might feel a little anxious about that, even though they're very competent and very knowledgeable, they just don't like public speaking. So maybe that friend can give me feedback about some of my content, so I will be the mouthpiece and they will be the brain, right? Well, that's another example of complementarity, right? So there are issues where you can complement another person. Well, I recommend that you always compliment another person. You know what I mean. And then trust, all right? We all know of examples from our own lives when trust has been a paramount issue. Now, one of the qualitative arguments that I make is that trust is kind of a logarithmic scale and these are linear. And what do I mean by that? I mean that trust is probably the most important thing for a strong and healthy relationship, a positive disposition. Okay? You can use this model in context other than just interpersonal relationships. We can think about the United States vis-a-vis other nations. Let's think about the United States vis-a-vis Great Britain. We trust them a lot. We've often pulled on the same rope, whatever the issue may be, right? We have a lot of compatibility, democracy, human rights, capitalism, free markets, etc., etc. We have a lot of compatibility. We have some complementarity. We've got more aircraft carriers than they do, and they like that about us, right? Well, they invented them, right? So you can think of other examples where we have complementarity between our nations. Now think about us vis-a-vis China, right? We've got a lot of complementarity, right? We want to buy a lot of stuff that they're making, and they want a lot of our dollars. Actually, they're having a problem. They have so many of our dollars, they're trying to figure out what to do with them. So they often buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which, hey, good for us, right? Anyway, complementarity between nation states can be important. Compatibility between us and China. Well, we both kind of like the idea of a free market. Free is in quotes in some contexts. We both, well, up until recently, we both like the idea of a cleaner environment, right? Because of all the smog and pollution problems, we were pulling on the same rope in terms of environmentalism up until a couple years ago. So we have some compatibility and some complementarity with China. But what about the trust factor? Not too good, right? So our disposition vis-a-vis China, the length of the vector in this three-dimensional space, the length of that vector is, it's always going to be pretty short because it's not going to extend very far up the trust axis, no matter what, right? Well, I guess you can make a long vector this way. We have a lot of compatibility. But without trust, your disposition will not be positive. So maybe there's some other mathematical model where it doesn't just have to be the length of the vector, but also there's a certain projection, etc. But it's still a useful tool, wouldn't you think? Right? To think about disposition in this way. Now, what if I do this? What if I say that not only can I have trust, but I can have distrust? Not only can I have compatibility, but I can have incompatibility. And I can be uncomplimentary, whatever that word is. Right? I can have a lack of complementary aspects. So once again, I'm not adding more dimensions, but I'm showing that you can go into negative territory with some of these things as well. You can have mistrust, you can have incompatibilities. So by taking these models, these toy models for helping you analyze something as complex as disposition, you can hopefully find some utility, some value out of these kinds of simplified models. Here's another. Mental acuity. This is another model I've used effectively over time. I'll state the three axes and then I'll give you three examples. Baloney Filter. There's another name that's not quite as pretty as that one, a BS filter. Intelligence and curiosity. Three different aspects of a mental life. All right? I have a friend, true story, I have a friend who is smart as the dickens. And this friend has a pretty darn good baloney filter. You know, scam marketing, somebody trying to pull a fast one on him in his personal life, etc. This person's got a good baloney filter and is quite intelligent from many different kinds of ways of looking at intelligence. But he has essentially no curiosity. Hey, let's talk about this. I'm not interested in that. Hey, I learned how black holes work. You want to talk about black holes? I'm not interested in that. Right? Etc., etc., etc. So I have a friend that has healthy curiosity, healthy intelligence. Oh, there I go. I'm characterizing. Has a large amount of intelligence, a large baloney filter, and almost no curiosity, right? That's an interesting way to think about a person, right? We've probably all encountered people like that. Here's another friend of mine. This friend of mine, this is true, I have people in my mind when I'm talking about this. I have another friend who's got a really good baloney filter and is very curious, right? So this friend is not likely to engage in conspiracy theory thinking, not likely to believe in pyramid power or quantum healing and some of these fringe things. Pretty good baloney filter, pretty good curiosity, but modest intelligence. You know, $5 words are not part of this friend's vocabulary, right? This friend isn't, one of the ways I say it is mental horsepower. This person just doesn't have a lot of mental horsepower. But this person is a dear friend of mine. Curiosity and BS or baloney filter go a long way. I have a third friend, honest to gosh, who's got a great deal of curiosity and a great deal of intelligence, but no baloney filter, right? I mean, you talk about pyramid power and crystal energy and horoscopes and alien visitations, you know, the sky is the limit regarding what's possible and real according to this person's model of reality that they carry around in their head, right? So my proposition to you is that this simple three-dimensional axis can help you better understand the mental acuity of a person. Now, this leaves off a lot. It doesn't account for different kinds of intelligence, although Joanne, I think you gave a talk about the single, was it the G factor or whatever it was? I mean, but it doesn't talk about creativity, right? It doesn't talk about moral rectitude, right? There's many aspects of a person's disposition and mental approach to the world that is not captured by this model. So again, that's why I call this a toy model. It's not a comprehensive psychological model of a human brain or a human being, but I think it still imposes a certain amount of discipline on our thinking about how we can conceptualize some of these issues. All right, here's another one of my, I believe it to be original. I haven't done a full literature search. Maybe other people have thought of this as well. People have been thinking for thousands of years. I just have about a 40-year record. So, when dealing with an existential threat, I propose there are three potential coping mechanisms that we can use. One is isolation, another is assimilation, and a third is annihilation. Whenever you perceive something is an existential threat to you, one of the first things you might do is lock your doors. You isolate yourself from the threat. All right? Annihilation. I'm going to grab a baseball bat too. And maybe I'm not one of the people who has a gun, but if I feel particularly threatened, maybe I grab a gun as well as locking the doors so that we can practice some potential annihilation. And assimilation. All right? The knock comes at the door. Here I am all nervous with sweaty hands on my baseball bat. I look through the peephole, and it's a friend of mine. Right? Or maybe it's a stranger. And I don't like strangers, but it turns out that this stranger has a compatibility and a complementarity sufficient for me to engage in the process of building a trust relationship, a new trust relationship with a new person, right? So, in any case, these three mechanisms for dealing with a perceived threat, my proposition, is that every strategy we deploy when faced with something we consider to be a potential threat is one version of this. Even running away. Running away is a form of isolation, right? I don't like that tiger, so I'm going to isolate myself from it by jumping into a river. But you can think about this in the context of nation states as well. That's one of the reasons I posit to you that these models are useful not just for thinking about interpersonal relationships, but also political relationships as well. I wrote a paper about this in the context of political relationships when I was taking political science courses. So, walls. Yeah.
Would you put cooperation and collaboration along the continuum of assimilation?
Yeah, and insofar as somebody cooperates and shares your motivations and your interests and your activities, then it's probably not an existential threat either. So this is specifically about when you perceive a threat.
Okay, and I was oriented to how do you deal with the threat?
Right. So yeah, so if you find a common ground, I mean, how many of us don't raise your hands. I don't want you to embarrass yourselves or otherwise in front of your friends here. How many of us have unfriended people on Facebook in the past couple of years? Or taken some other step on social media to limit what we consider to be disturbing, existentially dangerous ideas coming from other people? One of the easiest things we can do is to unfriend somebody. That's a form of isolation, right? How many of us instead, remember that thing you learned as a child that said, seek first to understand? How many of us have tried that? How many of us have gone, you cover your mouth, you stop your speak hole from working, and you try to understand, right? So, isolation is one of the easiest things to do. And it's so easy that civilizations all across the centuries have built walls. They built walls around cities. Sometimes they try to build walls around whole countries. But think about it. This is one of the few viable mechanisms for dealing with a perceived existential threat. Now, in my opinion, a really good case can be made about whether the particular circumstance on our southern border constitutes an existential threat. I think that's laughable, that argument, personally. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. But in any case, if you perceive an existential threat, one of the simplest things you can do is isolate yourself, building a wall. It's not very hurtful, and it's the same as locking your front door if you feel threatened by a stranger, okay? Here's another way that we've tried to isolate people. This is one of the outcomes of the way that the United States has dealt with its Native American population. We isolated them, right? We put them on parcels of land that are owned by the federal government. There's all kinds of economic implications of that, about institutionalizing poverty on Indian land, because the Native Americans cannot claim ownership and bootstrap themselves into small businesses and whatnot, right? It's a complicated issue, but by virtue of isolating groups of people, think about ghettos, right? You know, I don't want to spend much time talking about Germany and Nazism and whatnot, but one of the first things you do is you isolate a group of people that you consider to be threatening, right? It happens again and again and again throughout history. Another thing we can try is annihilation. And annihilation doesn't necessarily mean we're killing people. Annihilation can be vis-a-vis, for example, Native Americans. You can't teach your language. You can't practice your religion, right? So annihilation can be a cultural annihilation as well. Here's a native person, a famous picture of a native person dressed in what we would consider Western clothing. And then assimilation. Now there's a certain richness that is lost by wrapping everything in the umbrella of assimilation. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But here's a picture of, you know, arguably a better assimilated class. You know, there's a native person. I don't see any people of African descent in here. But this is arguably one step along the assimilation axis, right? And now you can talk about, in fact I will, I think is it the next? Yeah, this can be an oversimplification, and if you really want to delve into some of these topics, you really are passionate about them, I recommend that you account for some of these nuances. For example, assimilation might be a journey from tolerance which is, by the way, a negative emotion. Everybody talks about tolerance as if it's a good thing. Tolerance is the first ugly step towards a more accommodating and welcoming environment for all, right? Well, I will tolerate that person, right? I mean, that's a haughty, arrogant, paternalistic, rude kind of sentiment. I will tolerate your differences, right? You're already making a judgment call at that point. So tolerance can be a dirty word, but it's better than annihilation. It's better than isolation, you know, forcing black people to use their own drinking fountain and whatnot. When you have cases like happened in our history where the government interceded and forced integration and forced toleration, that was a step along a journey that we continue to this day. But tolerance is not necessarily, not ever the end goal. Tolerance might lead to acceptance, and it might lead to fuller integration. And then integration can be, well, you know, we've got Native American words, we've implemented certain Native American customs that we don't even think about, we've implemented certain German customs, certain African, West African cultural traditions. We have become America that is a melting pot. And one of the reasons that we're the melting pot of the world is because we're pretty good historically, not perfect by any means, but we're pretty good at the whole integration and assimilation thing. Or it could be, if you can't beat them, join them, right? If you have lower social power, lower economic power, maybe you proactively make the decision, or retroactively, or whatever the case may be, you make the decision that I can't beat this thing, so I'm going to conform to it. That's another form of assimilation. Remember, it's a toy model. It's simple, it's three-dimensional, because it's really hard to think about dimensions higher than 3. Lots of people have tried, and some mathematicians can represent them mathematically, but it's hard to think about them. And if you were to try, you notice that when I do a 2-dimensional projection of this 3-dimensional space, something ends up being a diagonal line here. This is actually, this red line is actually not so much at an angle as it appears there. Here's an example of a 3-dimensional, it's a 2-dimensional projection of a 3-dimensional model that is itself a 3-dimensional projection of a 4-dimensional cube. Called a tesseract. So if you want to think in 4 dimensions, you're welcome to play with tesseracts. Okay, now, here's the kicker. When I consider my disposition vis-a-vis another person, here I am, I've got high trust, really good compatibility, a little bit of complementarity, and then something happens and my trust goes up. I really needed a loan, I really needed moral support, I really needed a hug, I really needed that person not to tell a secret, whatever the case may be, my trust goes up. So my disposition vis-a-vis another entity, whether it's something abstract like the police or something concrete like my husband, my disposition can change over time. So when you add the 4th dimension, what you're doing is you're adding in motion. And you recognize that certain of these things can change over time. And in physics, that's called a world line. When you plot out the trajectory of a point over time, that's called its world line, because it goes through time, from the past all the way to the future. And thinking about some of these toy models I've given you in the context of how they might change, how you might change over time in terms of your disposition, in terms of your mental acuity, in terms of your Baloney filter, as you learn thinking critically, skills from Joanne and other presentations, as you change your own capabilities over time, and as you think differently about other people, or as you gather more evidence about other people, your disposition and their attributes in your model may change over time, and that can be very edifying. The moral of the story: a man much smarter than I am arrived at an essential point. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simply. All right, thank you very much. Questions?
Most of your models were 3D. two-dimensional, and I presume that that was because it's easy to illustrate the 3 dimensions. Tail end, you mentioned a 4th dimension, time, but there's no reason why they, when Stephanie brought up a couple other attributes for one to be a model, that they couldn't be 5, 6, 10, 100, different dimensions.
Sure.
And while you can't illustrate very well, you can, on a piece of paper with a graph,
Yeah.
you can describe the effects of
Sure.
different things.
Agreed. Yeah, so, again, that's why, one of the reasons I call these toy models, because, your disposition vis-a-vis another human being, or the United States disposition vis-a-vis China, or whatever, these can be very complex topics. But we want to be able to get useful information out of them. And these toy models that I presented to you, I would argue, are better than thinking about it in a manner that is often too simplistic. They're more complex and richer models for thinking than what we are often exposed to. The love-hate. I either love you or I hate you, kind of thing. And so, yes, 3 dimensions or 2 dimensions can be an oversimplification. Sometimes I think they're just the appropriate simplification. And if you have more than one, you can certainly do what you want, do what you suggest. You can list all of the relevant factors that you can think of across a page or a spreadsheet or whatever, and then give them relative weights. And some things may be, weighted heavier than others, like trust. In my argument, trust, in terms of your disposition or your relationships, trust is more important than complementarity, right? If I can't trust you, then everything else is out the window. So giving things relative weights in terms of their factors. And there's mathematical and sociological analytical tools that help you with that do multivariate analysis and look for independent variables, and you can control for one thing while changing the others and see if they really are independent. There's all kinds of, there's a universe of information about how to do that kind of analysis. But just start by recognizing that the world is often more complex than our linear thinking might otherwise tell us.
Statistics allows us to do multivariate analysis, and you can put it on a graph, you can put it out on a sheet, but you can't put it out in a model like this, because there are just too many variables, and they're all going in different directions. But the statistics allow us to look at them all and see the interaction between them, and say, this and this, for whatever odd reason, they seem to be related. There's some kind of, now it's up to the scientists to figure out what's going on here. But again, statistics allows us to play that game. And again, it is a game.
Right.
This is helpful in explaining why artificial intelligence is so challenging and problematic. Because the algorithms that are written by some individual teams mostly, the teams complicate factors on the matter. The algorithms that are written to try to capture, our sorting or decision process or whatever. And then some people object because something's left out or it's biased or something, so then it gets tweaked, and it could be a never-ending process, with the trade-offs being making it simple enough so some people can understand what's gone into the program.
But complex enough that it can actually model what it's intended to. Yeah, good point. Next, in 2 weeks, I'll be back and I'll be talking about the second topic in my, I think it'll be a 3-part series about the scientific disposition. I'm going to talk about the value of a practiced humility. Humility is a skill we can develop, and a valuable one. So anyway, just a talk about that. And if those of you who found this on Meetup, please leave a review. That's how other people know whether these are valuable or not. Any other discussions or questions? Yeah.
Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in so many ways.
I agree. You got any questions or comments, sir?
Hard to be humble when you're You know, at one point you said something about, this is what philosophers and scientists need to do, but I'm wondering is this something everybody should do, especially if we live in a democracy, where we have to make decisions? Is that something people can do?
That's my point, right? This series of 3 lectures is about attributes of introspection and mental discipline that scientists often try to bring to bear when analyzing a problem or a situation. And those attributes would be valuable to all of us. That's exactly my point.
Do you have these lectures on video anywhere?
Yeah, there's a YouTube channel for the humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland, of whom I'm a board member. And many of these lectures are up there. This one will be soon. All right, thank you all. See you soon.